It is October 1968. The Tokyo Motor Show. Inside one of the largest exhibition halls in Japan, thousands of people are packed shoulder to shoulder, pressing forward, craning their necks to see something that nobody expected. On a raised platform under bright lights, Honda has just pulled a cloth off a motorcycle, and the room has gone very, very quiet. The motorcycle sitting on that platform has 4 cylinders, a disc brake, 5 speeds, an electric starter. It looks like something that should belong on a racetrack, not in a showroom. And Honda is telling the world that any ordinary person can buy one. It is called the CB750, and it will change everything. Somewhere in the back of that crowded hall, a small group of engineers from Kawasaki are standing completely still. They have been working on a secret project for the past 2 years. A project so sensitive that most people at Kawasaki don't even know it exists. A project that was supposed to be their answer to the domination of the British motorcycle industry. Their statement to the world. In that moment, watching Honda's engineers smile for photographers, the Kawasaki team already knows what this means for them. Everything they have built, every late night, every argument over engine specifications, every rejected prototype. All of it has just been made irrelevant by a single motorcycle on a stage in Tokyo. But here is the part of the story that no one tells you. What Kawasaki decided to do next, in the weeks and months after that Tokyo Motor Show, was not to give up. It was not to walk away and find a different market segment. It was to do something so audacious, so borderline insane, that the engineers themselves reportedly questioned whether it was even possible. They decided to build something that would make Honda's engineers look like they hadn't tried hard enough. This is the story of Project New York State, the most secret motorcycle development program in Japanese history. And the machine it produced, the Kawasaki Z1, is still considered by many to be the greatest production motorcycle ever built. To understand what was at stake in that Tokyo exhibition hall, you need to go back 2 years, to 1966, and understand what the motorcycle world looked like before Honda changed it. In 1966, the performance motorcycle market was owned almost entirely by the British. If you wanted a fast bike, a real fast bike, the kind that made other riders step aside on the highway, you rode a Triumph Bonneville, or a BSA Lightning, or a Norton Atlas. These were big parallel twin engines, often around 650cc, and they were everything a motorcycle was supposed to be in that era. They sounded right. They looked right. They handled well enough for the roads of the time. And most importantly, they were British, which in the motorcycle world of the 1960s still carried an enormous amount of cultural weight. The Japanese manufacturers had arrived. Honda was selling hundreds of thousands of motorcycles every year. But they were small motorcycles, commuters. Economical machines for people who needed transportation, not speed. The big displacement performance market, the market that got you on magazine covers, that won you races, that made enthusiasts care about your brand name. That market still belonged to Britain. Kawasaki wanted to change that. In 1966, a small engineering team inside Kawasaki began working on a motorcycle that nobody was supposed to know about. They called the project, with characteristic Japanese understatement, New York Steak. The most expensive, most premium thing they could think of. The kind of meal that a manufacturer like Kawasaki was not supposed to be able to serve. What they were building was a 750cc 4-cylinder 4-stroke motorcycle. Double overhead camshafts, more displacement than anything the British brands were producing. More power than anything currently available to a regular person walking into a dealership. It was, by the standards of 1966, an absurdly ambitious machine. The team worked in isolation. Prototypes were moved after dark. Specification drawings were kept in a single locked office. Resources were allocated quietly, without any announcements that might alert the industry, or, more importantly, Honda, to what Kawasaki was planning. By the autumn of 1968, they were close. Not finished, but close. Close enough that the conversations about a launch timeline were starting to happen. Close enough that certain senior executives at Kawasaki had begun to imagine what it would feel like to walk into that market and introduce something that nobody had seen coming. And then Honda walked onto a stage in Tokyo with the CB750. And for a moment, everything stopped. Here is what made the CB750 so catastrophic for Kawasaki. It was not just that Honda had built a 4-cylinder motorcycle. It was that Honda had built a 4-cylinder motorcycle that was better than the one Kawasaki had been secretly developing for 2 years. The CB750 had a single overhead cam versus Kawasaki's planned double overhead cam. So technically, on a pure engineering level, Kawasaki's engine architecture was more sophisticated, but the CB750 was already done. It was going into production. It was going to be in showrooms before the end of the year. And when journalists and customers compared the two machines, they would not care about overhead cam configurations. They would see two 750cc 4-cylinder Japanese motorcycles, and they would ask one question: which one came first? Honda came first. Honda would always have come first. And in the motorcycle world, being second is not a prize. The Kawasaki team flew home from Tokyo and held a meeting. By all accounts, it was not a pleasant meeting. The options were brutal. Option 1, scrap the New York State project entirely and find a different path. Accept that Honda had beaten them to the 750cc four-cylinder market and walk away. Option 2, rush the existing design to market as quickly as possible, and hope that Kawasaki's double overhead cam specification was enough to differentiate the machine from the CB750 in the minds of consumers. But there was a third option, one that the engineers apparently raised, almost hesitantly, as if they weren't sure it was responsible to say it out loud. Don't build a 750, build something bigger. Don't match Honda, beat Honda. Not narrowly, not by a single horsepower or a slight edge in top speed. Beat Honda in a way that is so complete and so obvious that no journalist, no customer, no competitor can argue with it. This is where the story becomes something more than a business decision. Because what Kawasaki chose to do in the aftermath of that Tokyo Motor Show is the reason the zone exists. And the reason the zone exists is, in large part, a story about what happens when engineers get angry. The team dismantled the existing 750cc project, 2 years of work set aside. And they started again, this time targeting 900cc. A displacement increase that sounds modest until you realize what it means in terms of engineering. New cylinder bore, new stroke calculations, new crankshaft design, new carburation requirements. They were not modifying the existing engine. They were building something fundamentally different while keeping the architectural approach that made the original design special. They also kept the double overhead camshaft configuration, even though it was more expensive and more complex to manufacture. Not because it was strictly necessary, but because it was better. And if Kawasaki was going to beat Honda, they were going to beat them with a machine that was genuinely, technically, demonstrably superior. Not just bigger. There is something else nobody tells you about this decision. Honda had been filing patents aggressively in the 750cc four-cylinder space. The CB750 development team had been thorough in protecting their intellectual territory. A direct Kawasaki competitor at 750cc would have meant years of potential legal challenges, licensing complications, and market confusion. By going to 900cc, Kawasaki stepped cleanly outside the most densely patented zone. The decision to upsize was not just competitive strategy, it was also, quietly, a legal masterstroke. The engineers went back to work. But now, the pressure was different. Because Honda's CB750 was in showrooms. It was on the covers of every major motorcycle magazine in America and Europe. Riders who had been waiting for a Japanese performance machine were buying it by the tens of thousands. And inside Kawasaki's locked development room, the clock was ticking in a way it had never ticked before. They worked through 1969, they worked through 1970, and they worked through 1971. There were setbacks. An engine that is being pushed to new power levels at new displacement does not cooperate easily. Heat management in the early prototypes was unpredictable. Valve timing at high RPM produced results that were promising but inconsistent. The carburation, 4 carburetors feeding a high-revving engine in an era before fuel injection, required hundreds of hours of tuning. These are the kinds of problems that kill projects quietly, not in a single catastrophic failure but in an accumulation of small frustrations that eventually make the people in charge decide that it is not worth continuing. But Kawasaki continued. There is a specific quality to an engineering team that has something to prove, and that team had it completely. Every time a test run produced disappointing numbers, they did not question whether the target was achievable. They questioned what they had done wrong and how to fix it. The CB750 existed in the world as a constant reminder of what it meant to fall short. And that reminder, apparently, was more motivating than any bonus or deadline or management pressure. By early 1972, they had an engine that produced 82 horsepower. That was 8 more than Honda's CB750. The claimed top speed was over 130 miles per hour. The engine displaced 903c. The dual overhead cam setup meant that at high revs, the zone did something the CB750 simply could not do. It kept making power. But Kawasaki was not ready to announce it yet. Because they had decided to do something first that would eliminate any argument about the zone's reliability, durability, or real-world performance, they were going to take it to Daytona. In September of 1972, before the official public launch, a team of riders and engineers traveled to Daytona International Speedway with a small fleet of largely stock zone motorcycles. The machines had some minor modifications for the endurance attempt, different handlebars, slightly adjusted suspension setup, but the engines were essentially what you would buy in a dealership, and for 24 hours, they ran them, non-stop. Lap after lap after lap around a circuit that had destroyed purpose-built race machines from manufacturers with far more racing experience. The zone motorcycles did not break. In 24 hours of continuous high-speed running, They set 39 international speed and endurance records. 39. Records that had stood for years fell in a single night at Daytona, and when the results were formally submitted and verified, Kawasaki had documentation that no marketing campaign could have produced. They had proof. On September 13, 1972, the Zone was officially revealed at the Cologne International Motorcycle and Bicycle Exhibition. It was priced at $1,895, considerably more than the CB750, and the reaction from the motorcycle press was immediate and overwhelming. Road Test magazine said the Zone had made every other production motorcycle obsolete. Cycle magazine, which had spent years celebrating the CB750 as the benchmark for what a superbike should be, described the Zone's engine as a revelation. Motorcyclists called it the King, a nickname that would stay with the Zone for decades. Journalists who arrived at Cologne expecting to write a story about a capable Honda competitor left having written about the new undisputed standard for what a production motorcycle could achieve. And here is where you need to know what was happening at Honda at the same moment. Honda engineers saw the Zone in Cologne. They saw the specification sheet. They did the math. And they understood, immediately and without ambiguity, what had happened. A company that Honda had not considered its primary competitor in the large displacement market had, in secret, over a period of years, built a machine that was faster, more powerful, and technically more sophisticated than the motorcycle Honda had believed would define the category for years to come. The story that circulates in Japanese motorcycle industry circles, and it is the kind of story that is impossible to verify precisely but too consistent across too many sources to dismiss, is that when a senior Honda engineer first saw the Zone specification sheet at Cologne, he read the displacement figure, set the paper down face first on the table, and said nothing. He did not need to say anything. The people in that room already understood. Honda had been beaten by the team from the locked room. In the American market, the Zone created waiting lists at dealerships that Kawasaki had not anticipated. American Kawasaki executives had actually argued, before the launch, that the price was too high. That American customers would not pay nearly $2,000 for a Japanese motorcycle, no matter how impressive it was. Those arguments were settled very quickly by the market. Riders who had ordered CB750s called their dealerships and asked about changing their order. Riders who had never considered Kawasaki as a serious performance brand walked into showrooms and asked to be put on the list. But then the racing started. And that is when the full impact of what Kawasaki had built began to become clear. The engineers who designed the Zone had made a specific choice during the development process that was not visible in the specification sheet, but would define the machine's legacy for decades. They had over-engineered the bottom end. The crankcase, the crankshaft, the connecting rods. All of it was built with considerably more structural integrity than the baseline power output required. They had built headroom into the engine. Room for the machine to be modified, developed, pushed far beyond what the stock configuration suggested. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate engineering philosophy. Kawasaki knew the Zone would be raced. They knew private tuners and racing teams would take the engine apart and try to extract more power from it. And they built an engine that would survive that process. An engine that would reward the people who tried. The results were extraordinary. Zone-based machines began appearing in endurance races across Europe and America. At the 1973 Daytona 200, modified Zones ran competitively against purpose-built race machines from manufacturers with far longer racing histories. In European endurance racing, Zone-derived bikes began winning outright. The Bull D'Or, the Liège 24 Hours. Race after race, the Zone engine proved that it was not simply a road bike. It was a racing platform that happened to come with a headlight. Honda, for their part, did not sit still. The response to the Zone came in stages. Revised CB750 variants, eventually the CB900F, then the legendary CB1100. Each new model a direct reaction to what Kawasaki had done. And in that competition, across the following decade, both companies produced some of the most remarkable production motorcycles ever made. But something is only visible with hindsight. The Zone had changed the way the entire industry thought about what a superbike needed to be. Before it existed, the CB750 defined the category. After it existed, the category had no ceiling. The Zone begat the Z900. The Z900 begat the Zone 1000, and a lineage that continues to the present day. The Kawasaki Z series, direct descendants of the machine those engineers built in secret after Tokyo, 1968, remains one of the most recognized names in motorcycle history. And the philosophical legacy of the Zone reaches beyond Kawasaki. Every manufacturer that has ever decided to go bigger, go faster, go further than what the market expected, they are working, whether they know it or not, in the tradition of what happened in that locked room. The Kawasaki Zone launched with a retail price that Kawasaki's own American executives thought was too high. It sold out anyway. It set endurance records before it went on sale. It beat motorcycles that were built specifically to race. It made Honda rethink what they had assumed was untouchable, and it earned a nickname that its rivals were never given: the King. If you have ever seen a Zone in person, you already understand. There is something about that machine, the way the double overhead cam engine sits in the frame, the sound at high revs, the proportions that were clearly designed by people who knew exactly what they were trying to say, that does not feel like the product of a company trying to compete. It feels like the product of a company that had decided, very quietly, a long time ago, that they were going to win. They built it in secret. They proved it at Daytona before anyone knew it existed. They revealed it in Cologne and watched the world's motorcycle press change their minds about what was possible in real time. And they made Honda executives stare at a specification sheet and set it face down on the table without saying a word. That is the story of the Kawasaki Zone. The motorcycle that started as a response to defeat, lived in secrecy for years, and arrived in the world ready to be king.